Okay, well, thanks again to, of course, our dear organizers, Antonio and Julia. Thank you for everyone else who has been presented their work, presented the discussions, really a lot these past days. The paper that I'm presenting deals with the connection between soil science and geopolitical thought. So to contextualize that a little bit, my dissertation is interested in the history of the sciences of soils, particularly the political history of the sciences of soils. So I'm interested in how soil scientific ideas, concepts, understandings of the natural world, but also the social world, how they circulate, how they transform material organizations of our world, from urban architecture, sewage systems, fertilizer technologies, agrarian practices, this paper, which is really much more of a thinking piece, let's say, than a concrete argument, allows me to explore something that was a bit on the margins of that dissertation, which was the connection between geopolitical thought and soil science in a particular time period and a particular scientific register. Now, the way I talk about the politics of soil science is to use the term by Latour and Stengers and others of cosmopolitics, right? Which is to say, we have to understand the ways in which scientific practices, on the one hand, they're of course influenced by their societal context, but they are also able to transform these contexts. And it's that sort of interaction which is really interesting, which is also what I'm focusing on. And to give you a little bit of a sense of what I'm currently interested in, which comes out of that as an offshoot, and Antonio and Meijer sort of explored it together, is the history of soilless agriculture as a particular way of understanding soils, particular way of understanding the natural world, also responding to environmental concerns in the early 20th century context. So that's the history of hydroponics and these kinds of technologies, which were labeled soilless gardening, a beautiful term. And we're also mobilized geostrategically, for example, by the US Army during the Second World War. And so there's all kinds of interesting elements there. But that's sort of what I'm currently thinking of and currently working on. And I would also love to have pick your brains on if you have anything interesting to add there. But something that is running through that history of soil science is a way of thinking about soils and using soils as a conceptual medium to think about the planet and planetary boundaries, planetary limitation. It's a history of thinking about the Earth in Malthusian terms as a sort of a bounded space. Thinking also of Reagan's paper on enclosed world, which you also see in this example of hydroponics as a sort of a small model for thinking about the world and vice versa. Okay, now I'll move on to the particular epistemology of soils that I'm interested in here in the paper, which is towards the late 19th century, early 20th century, you see the emergence of a very unique understanding of soils and soil science in different contexts, which sort of converge and become more internationally established in the early 20th century. And this is the idea that we should understand soils, as was very dominant in the 20th century, as a collection of nutrients, plant nutrients, right, which was an agrochemical way of understanding that soils and the natural world. But we should understand soils in sort of loosely geological terms, but not as geologists would understand it, right, which was to reduce it to the parent materials, but to understand soils as this body that lays on the surface of the earth, that emerges, that has a particular natural history, emerges through the interaction of different kinds of agencies and forms different types of, well, soil types, different types of soils. So there was an interest in things like the formation of soil horizons, right? These sort of differently colored and composed layers of soils as a way of identifying particular soil types, which have different properties, different capacities for food production, etc., etc. So you see a movement from the lab laboratory as a primary site for knowledge production to the map as a very important epistemological tool to think about soils and to think about the relationship between soils, things like agriculture or spatial development. The laboratory still remains the site for knowledge production, but it becomes sort of subservient to mapping, soil mapping. And this all leads to what I sort of characterize as a spatial temporalization of soils. So to understand soils as these bodies that emerge in specific sites over long periods of time, right? And so really the notion of time is very important. I also think back on your keynote and Whitley work on the four-dimensionality of geopolitics, right? Time is very important, but also this idea that soils are not the same everywhere. There are different types of soils, and we have to take that as sort of the starting point to think about soils and the relationship between soils and society, for example. This is something that these soil scientists really start to emphasize in the early 20th century. Oh, it's the wrong way. So the map, that is something that I want to think about very centrally, and that is also where there's a lot of interaction between geopolitics and soil science. And so the map has a very peculiar function to these soil sciences. It is providing of course, you see the overview of how soils are distributed in space, which then becomes the literal and figurative ground for the organization of society. These soil maps, they're envisaged, at least by the soil scientists, as providing the basis, the conceptual basis for things like spatial development. But they also have another really interesting and important role, which is they act as translation devices. Because all these soil types and the diversity of soil types become so central, what these soil maps allow you to do is to say, well, you have a certain thing here, a plant that grows well, for example, in an agricultural context, or a certain mode of irrigation that works very well. And you want to transplant it here. Well, we see that there's the same soil type, so you are actually able to translate that practice, that experience to another setting, which was also used to, for example, transplant peoples in imperial contexts. So this map here is a map of southern Sumatra, produced in the 30s in a context of what was called a policy of transmigration. So there was a concern with overpopulation by Dutch imperial administrators on Java. They thought, well, all these Javans, they cannot take care of themselves, and we have to take care of them. There was also the specter of political violence and political unrest. And what better way to handle this than to, encourage them to migrate to peripheral islands, right? Also as a strategy to gain more of a foothold on these peripheral islands and these peripheral regions, like the south of Sumatra. And these soil maps, they played a very important role there because there was a particular understanding of Javan farmers, which was to say they were very conservative, they were tied to their place, they were tied to their way of living, and they would only expect to live somewhere else if they would be able to reproduce their very peculiar kind of agricultural existence, which centered on wet rice culture in another context. So these soil maps, they were used to identify the proper locations for these Javan farmers to be settled to. Okay. And so there's a lot of thinking by these soil scientists on the soil map and its sort of ideal role in society that is very interesting and sort of resonates a lot with a lot of geopolitical themes. So part of the paper that I do is, on the one hand, I look at existing interest among more canonic figures in geopolitical traditions, especially the German tradition, which read these soil scientists, and they use some of their ways of thinking about the natural world for their own ends, for their own analytical ends. But there's also the other side of the coin, which is to say that these soil scientists themselves, they were also producing certain proto-geopolitical ways of thinking, let's say, which really, especially can be seen in these sort of mapping contexts. What's your approach? Now, central part of my work focuses on not just what makes soils valuable, what makes them productive, which I call the resourcefulness of soils, but also what, and it was a notion that Antonio so nicely gave to me, what is the resourcefulness of soils? What is the fragility of soils, the liminality of soils? And you see that as we move from a primarily agrochemical register of understanding soils and the value of soils, but also the limitations of soils, you also, to a more geological understanding of soils, you also see a shift in this understanding of the resourcelessness of soils. So geology and geological structures of soils become central aspects in thinking about, well, things like the destruction of the natural world as a result of mechanization of agriculture, for example. Right? The soil erosion in the late 19th century, you see this emerging as this space for thinking about, well, the natural limits, natural catastrophe that is looming over industrial society, especially in the face of mechanized agriculture, and especially in the British colonial context, right? And that sort of continues into the let's say the history of international organizations like the FAO and UNESCO, which take up this problem space in many ways. Okay, so to draw it maybe to a conclusion, then considering the time.
You still have 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't understand the signal. The final part of my paper then explores how, let's say, that tradition of geopolitical thinking and that practice of soil science comes together in a more practical context. So there are some convergences between on a more conceptual level between geopolitics and soil science, but the more interesting and the more concrete convergence operates on a more practical level. One example that I do want to point out of let's say how geopolitical thinkers used soil science and soil mapping was in the work of Pank, and you also have political geographers after Pank who deal with this notion of the Deutsche Volks- und Kulturboden, so the Volks soils and the cultural soils of Germany, right? And so they really explicitly use this imaginary of the soil mapping as a way to reimagine well, the Germanness of land beyond the Weimar Republic. Right, and this is sort of in a post-Versailles revisionary spirit. Language plays an important role, but also really soil and how well soils are cultivated and how well lands are maintained. And so this well is an example that I want to give to you to well make you think about how that interaction looks like. But it's primarily in this sort of imagination of Central and Eastern Europe in a German imperial context, of course, that is where you see the two really coming together. So extensive soil surveys were done prior to the envisaged German settlement of Central and Eastern Europe to identify the right kinds of soils. And one particular soil type was very important, which was the black soils, the Chernozem, which was also very importantly the soil type that was super influential in launching the field of agrogeology or pedology in the first place by the work of the Russian Vasily Dokuchaev in the late 19th century, who was also interested in erosion again. And because these plain soils, which you also found in North America, they had a particular vulnerability to wind erosion. So there's all these themes coming together. And so there was a notion in a German context of Verstärkung, which was sort of a racially codified environmentalist language, which envisaged this Eastern space as being destroyed by Slavic influences, and the proper German settlement and cultivation of these lands would be pivotal to protecting soils, but also establishing a proper eastern frontier that would help defend Germany against the incursions from the east. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Move to the conclusions. So the basic question that I'm interested in, and that sort of ties it back to your keynote, Luke, and the response or the interactions that you had with Olaf. What is that materialism in that material tradition, right? So we talk about geopolitics, but what is that geo? And it's not entirely clear what it is. And actually, there's a lot to disentangle and unpack, right? Whether we're talking about the oceans, whether we're talking about the soils, and how we are talking and thinking about the soils, and how our historical actors are talking and thinking about the soils. So, well, I've tried to tease out one interesting pathway there. A theme that sort of converges or makes geopolitical thought and this agrogeological thought converge is the idea of spatial diversity, and that there are different types of soils that are influenced by different environmental conditions. That becomes sort of the starting point for thinking about how soils influence human politics, but also simply environmental conditions. And then there's the theme of agency, which is really interesting, because one thing that is not picked up so prominently by geopolitical thinkers is exactly this question of soil erosion, which is central to the soil sciences in the early 20th century context. Whitsley picks up on it. There is Albert Penck, the son of Karl, that picks up on it. But there's not that many figures that I at least found that do this. And so there's something interesting there, right? Because especially the German geopolitical thinkers, of course, are captivated by the power of the soil to dominate human society, not the other way around. So there is something in that question of soil erosion that is interesting. And finally, the theme that I want to point out here is that what, of course, brings both of them together is the implicit third that connects soils and society, which is the political authority of the state. Because the soil sciences, they don't exist. They exist explicitly in relation to to state institutions and state projects and state authority. And so, of course, does geopolitical. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.